Our Prehistory is 100% listener funded, so please consider becoming a patron of the show. For $3 a month, you gain access to exclusive episodes, maps, and timelines. I really appreciate your support, which allows our exploration of prehistory to continue. To become a patron, click on the link in the description of this episode, or go to patreon.com/ourprehistory. A cavern, illuminated by a single torch, stretched far out of sight. A 13-year-old boy saw his breath in the air as he followed closely behind a man. They stepped over a maze of fallen stone and turned down a narrow corridor, branching off to the right. The boy was being led to a place where only men were allowed. He was exhausted. He hadn't eaten for a day and had slept outside of camp the previous night, in preparation for what awaited him at the back of this cave. He'd only been told that he would learn the secret of the lion. In this narrow passageway, he caught glimpses of images on the walls, giant deer and rhinoceros. His unease grew as he heard rhythmic chanting echoing around him. The corridor gave way to a wide, tall chamber. In the center was a fire, encircled by cloaked figures seated on the ground, singing a recurring sequence of words. The boy was directed to stand inside the circle and join the chanting. After several minutes, the combination of fatigue and rhythmic repetition brought upon him a sensation of euphoria. He forgot where he was and became entranced by the images on the wall. All of a sudden, one of the cloaked figures stood up, and as the others continued their recitation, this man told the story of the great lion. As he did, the storyteller's torch illuminated towering scenes of lions snapping at the heels of bison. It was almost as if the animals had come to life with movement. With a flourish, the storyteller ended by asking the great lion to fill the boy with his hunting spirit. This is Chauvet Cave, in southeastern France, and people entered its deepest caverns around 36,000 years ago and built fires. We don't know if they conducted rituals like this one, but they did create some of the finest art of the Upper Paleolithic. Their monumental cave paintings expressed the Aurignacian understanding of the natural and spiritual world. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 13, Aurignacian Art. Last episode, we began exploring the Aurignacian, a culture that lasted from 42,000 to 33,000 years ago, and came to dominate Europe after the extinction of the Neanderthals. The people of the Aurignacian continued the trend of technological innovation that began during the migration of Homo sapiens across Eurasia. They invented new hunting weapons and bone tools, exploited new raw materials like ivory and antler, and even constructed simple camp structures. A specialized set of tools was carried by these mobile nomads, scattered thinly across the landscape, hunting reindeer, horse, and wild goat. Aurignacian inventions marked a permanent increase in the technological complexity in Europe. Yet, technology is not the most noteworthy development of this culture. It's Aurignacian symbolic creation that most captures our attention today. Personal ornaments and artistic images were left behind in larger quantities and greater variety than any preceding archaeological culture anywhere in the world. Furthermore, several forms of artistic production, including painting and carving, appear in the archaeological record for the first time. In this episode, we will examine the symbolic elements of Aurignacian life, see what they can reveal about how these people saw the world, and ask why an artistic explosion took place in Europe 40,000 years ago. Archaeologists refer to artifacts as symbolic when they believe that the person who used that object imbued it with a special meaning, which was understood by others. In other words, that item stood as a symbol for another thing or idea, and this connection was something invented by people. For example, if someone wore a red stone necklace upon reaching adulthood, that ornament communicated an idea to other members of that culture. Unfortunately, the meaning applied by prehistoric people to their artifacts are lost to us. This human ability to think symbolically is related to our capacity for language and is extremely useful for creating cooperative societies. Hunter-gatherers that still live today use symbolic objects and rituals to mark important events. These symbols also reinforce values that are important in these cultures. The Aurignacian continues a trend towards the intensification of symbolic production. In Africa, before the migration of Homo sapiens out of that continent, humans were already thinking symbolically. They occasionally used pigments, made seashell ornaments, and engraved simple geometric patterns into ostrich eggshell and stone. Then, around 45,000 years ago in Europe, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals of the initial Upper Paleolithic, Ulusian, and Chattelperronian cultures made beads and pendants from a variety of materials. This was a marked increase in ornament production compared to the preceding Middle Paleolithic, when only Neanderthals lived in Europe. After the disappearance of Neanderthals and transitional cultures, people made body decorations even more frequently and in larger quantities. At least 100 Aurignacian campsites across Europe containing beads, pendants, and other forms of ornaments have been discovered. Some sites in Germany, Belgium, France, and Italy were especially rich in symbolic artifacts, containing hundreds of ornaments. Not only did Aurignacian people make lots of ornaments, but as we will see, they also crafted them using more complex, time-intensive techniques than ever before. With the Aurignacian, for the first time in our journey through prehistory, evidence of symbolic thought is not restricted to beads, simple engravings, or ochre. With the Aurignacian, complex art appears in different forms. Ivory was carved into figurines. Rock walls were engraved and painted. Some of the images produced were simple, like dots, lines, rings, and handprints. This type of art is referred to by academics as abstract. But the people of the Aurignacian also produced more complex representational art, which depicted things that they observed in the world. The most common subjects of Aurignacian representational art were animals. Some of their carvings and paintings demonstrate exceptional mastery of sophisticated artistic techniques, resulting in surprisingly accurate and evocative depictions. Before I go on to describe Aurignacian symbolism in more detail, I think it's important to put this period into a global context. There are two other places in the world where representational art has been clearly dated to around the same time as the Aurignacian. First, in Sulawesi, Indonesia, rock wall paintings of wild pigs and buffalo are now known to be 45,000 years old. That's 3,000 years before the start of the Aurignacian. Second, the oldest clearly dated works of rock art in Africa are 31,000-year-old paintings of animals from Namibia. The discovery of rock paintings in such widespread locations of roughly the same age suggests that the basic human mental capacity to produce representational art must have been present in Africa before the dispersal of our species out of that continent. But this raises the question, why haven't we found art made by humans during the Middle Stone Age or during the first dispersals across Eurasia? This probably comes down to a few key factors. First, older art is less likely to have survived than younger art. For example, rock walls, which were often used by prehistoric people as canvases, are subject to collapse and erosion, removing traces of paintings and engravings. This makes the discovery of Middle Stone Age rock art less likely. Second, rock art is difficult for scientists to date. For instance, ochre paint on a rock wall can't itself be dated, and only under certain circumstances can the age of art produced with this common pigment be determined. Third, in different regions, people produce symbolic objects using different materials, some of which were more likely to be preserved. Finally, the practices and worldview of different prehistoric cultures may have encouraged more artistic production than others. All of this is to say that Europe around 40,000 years ago was not the site of the origin of art. Instead, we should view the Aurignacian as the oldest period of prehistory from which archaeologists have uncovered a large collection of well-preserved and dated images. It was an interesting local culture that encouraged the production of symbolic elements, not the place where a fundamental capacity for art arose. To understand what led to this development, let's take a closer look at what Aurignacian people left behind. Most evidence of Aurignacian symbolic culture has been found in Western and Central Europe, with little to the east. This pattern is most likely due to poorer preservation of organic materials, like bones, teeth, shells, and ivory, and not to a genuine absence of ornaments and art in Eastern Aurignacian culture. In Western Europe, an incredible variety of beads and pendants were produced. People of this culture used an assortment of naturally occurring materials and shaped some of them into distinctive forms. One study counted over 150 types of Aurignacian ornaments across Europe. Some of this variation can be attributed to different regional customs. Near the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, people primarily used seashells. At least 62 different species of shells with human-made holes for stringing have been found alongside Aurignacian tools. On the Italian peninsula, the tusk-shaped shells favored during the preceding Ulusian continued to be collected during the Aurignacian, but other shells were added to this decorative repertoire. In particular, people here like to collect the shell of a striking bright red sea snail. The selection of this species seems to mark an Aurignacian tradition in southern Europe. Shell ornaments were transported far inland from the Mediterranean coast. Red sea snail shells have been found with Aurignacian tools in central France, and tusk shells were carried more than 300 kilometers into Austria, north of the Alps. This long-distance transportation exceeds that seen during preceding European cultures. Much as with high-quality stone, the movement of shells suggests that these items were valued by the people who carried them, people who traveled long distances and probably maintained trading connections with widespread groups. As we move away from the Mediterranean coast of Europe, we encounter different types of ornaments. For example, delicate bone tubes engraved with decorative circles around their circumference. Also, further north, animal teeth were collected and converted into beads by making a hole through the root of the tooth. The teeth of at least 18 different animals were used along the northern range of the Aurignacian culture, in an arc from northern Spain to Romania. Interestingly, Aurignacian people preferred to use the teeth of specific animals and ignored those of others. For example, reindeer teeth were barely used, even though they were the most commonly hunted animal of northern Aurignacians. Instead, carnivores seem to have had a particular importance in this culture. The most widespread tooth ornament was the sharp canine teeth of fox and wolf, found at over 30 different camps. Also, common across the north were enormous bear and lion canines, and the large incisors of horse and bison. However, Aurignacian people did not only use the teeth of fierce animals. The incisors and canines of gentle red and fallow deer were also converted into beads. Surprisingly, in southern Europe, teeth were hardly ever used for ornaments, even though fox, deer, and horse were hunted there. One key exception is along the Mediterranean coast of Spain, where lynx teeth were traditional. The importance of specific animal teeth to Aurignacian people can be seen in some especially interesting objects. At 2 camps from this period, imitation horse and deer teeth were carved from antler and bone, suggesting that they held a special meaning. Regional differences in the symbolic life of Aurignacians are further exemplified by the use of ivory for ornamental purposes. In France, Belgium, and Germany, where mammoths lived in large numbers at the time, people collected ivory from tusks of mammoth skeletons and developed complex methods of working this material. Ivory is a hard substance, and shaping it with stone tools was difficult and time-consuming. Yet these ancient Europeans used it to create at least 30 different styles of small beads and large pendants. Tiny beads, around 6 millimeters long, were the most common product. In southern France, these were made into the shape of a basket, with a hole for stringing between what looks like the handle and the base. Basket beads have been found at dozens of Aurignacian camps. In places where access to ivory was limited, such as northern Spain, this basket shape was replicated with soft soapstone or antler. It's believed that these beads were sewn into clothing, sort of like sequins. In southern Germany, ivory workers made different types of beads. Our evidence for this comes from a region called Swabia, found just north of the Alps along the Danube River. Swabia seems to have been a cultural hotspot during the Aurignacian. 4 caves discovered within 50 kilometers of each other were centers of ivory working, where large numbers of symbolic artifacts were found. At these caves, the most common ivory beads were oval in shape, with 2 holes drilled at either end. These are referred to as double perforated beads. Both the basket beads of France and the double perforated beads of Swabia were made using a similar sequence of steps. These stages were reconstructed by archaeologists based on the discovery of intermediate products at ivory working sites. First, ivory was extracted from the tusk by splitting and chopping, probably using antler wedges and heavy stone. Next, strips of ivory were ground into long, narrow rods. Then, the rods were cut at regular intervals, which allowed them to be snapped into beads. Finally, beads were finished by more grinding, perforating, and polishing to leave the final product smooth to the touch. This process allowed the production of hundreds of consistently shaped products. The highly technical and time-consuming nature of ivory working leads to an interesting question. Why would people start investing so much time in apparently non-productive activity? Some academics believe that the large number of ornaments during the Aurignacian is evidence of the increasing importance of social relationships. Intensification of bead crafting may be linked to a tradition of gift-giving, aimed at maintaining a network of friendly relationships. This could have taken on a competitive nature, with people trying to curry goodwill in order to obtain favors in return, such as the right to visit other bands. In this sense, the time spent making ornaments might have resulted in actual material benefits for those who made them. While basket and double perforated beads were the most numerous, many other shapes of ivory were produced, including small disc, droplet, and figure 8 beads. At most Aurignacian sites where ornaments are found, larger ivory pendants also appear. Around 5 centimeters long, rectangular or oval in shape, and sometimes engraved with decorative motifs, composed of lines and dots, these pendants express the individuality of the members of this culture. Another fascinating ivory ornament found at dozens of sites in France is a so-called diadem or hairband, which were long and narrow with decorative engravings and small holes at either end. One interpretation of these diadems is that they were worn on the head. Finally, in Belgium, which was one of the most northerly points of Aurignacian culture, ivory rings were popular items of jewelry. This summary of Aurignacian ornaments makes it clear that during this period of European prehistory, there were strong regional differences in styles. North of the Alps, ivory and teeth were preferred, while along the Mediterranean, shells were favored. In southern France, ivory basket beads prevailed, while in Swabia double perforated beads, and in Belgium, rings. Some archaeologists have proposed the hypothesis that regional variation in body decoration reflects distinct ethnicities, groups who spoke different languages. This is based on the study of modern-day hunter-gatherer groups, in which ornament styles correlate closely with ethnic groups, suggesting that prehistoric decorative artifacts may serve as markers of language groups. Although we often speak of the Aurignacian as a single culture because of similarities in stone tools across Europe, patterns and ornaments reveal that the inhabitants of Europe at this time maybe should be considered distinct cultures, who were linked by a shared origin and by occasional contact. The regional distinction is most pronounced between groups living north and south of the Alps, a divergence that probably originated during the initial migration of Aurignacians into Europe from the Middle East. Aurignacian art that has survived until the present comes in two major forms: ivory carvings and rock art. Much like ornaments, these two artistic traditions have quite different geographic distributions. Evidence of ivory carving during the Aurignacian is limited to the Swabian region of southern Germany. On the other hand, rock art, which includes engravings and paintings, was a much more widespread phenomenon, ranging across northern Spain, southern France, and northern Italy. In total, more than 30 sites have been found with either abstract or representational images. As I mentioned earlier, Aurignacian art most frequently depicts animals. Swabian ivory carvings were mostly small figurines that could easily fit inside the palm of your hand. You might assume that since these are the oldest known artistic carvings, that they might be rather simplistic. But surprisingly, they were exquisitely sculpted pieces made by highly skilled artists. Smooth, rounded animal figures with details faithfully engraved, leaving no doubt as to the identity of each animal. Over 50 whole or fragmented ivory figurines have been discovered in 4 Swabian caves. The carvings most commonly depict 2 large and dangerous animals, mammoths and lions, creatures that Aurignacians might have been fearful of encountering in real life. But a wide variety of other animals were also made, including horses, bison, a duck, and a fish. In fact, these figurines are highly individualized, none like any other, and most have mysterious engravings, including X's that look more like a notation than part of the animal. Carving a block of ivory into a figurine would have taken at least a full day of work. Their small size suggests that they were portable, carried by people for a long time, maybe their whole life. Exactly what these figurines meant to the people who bore them is a mystery. But as we will see, animals played a special role in the Aurignacian world. Although the vast majority of figurines were animals, there are a few fascinating exceptions. A couple are clearly human. One is a relief of a person carved into a piece of ivory. This piece has been nicknamed the worshipper because the image is of a person holding their hands above their head. Of course, we have no idea what this position actually represented to the person who carved it. Two other significant ivory figurines are neither fully animal nor human. Instead, they are hybrids, standing on two human legs but with the head and front paws of a lion. One of these stands 31 centimeters tall and is by far the largest Aurignacian figurine ever discovered. This so-called Lion Man statue is one of the most famous works of art from the Aurignacian because it provides the oldest evidence of religion in history. The most common interpretation of this statue is that it represents a mythological being, half human, half lion, that was part of the Aurignacian belief system. Exactly what role the Lion Man played in Aurignacian mythology is unknown, but it's convincing evidence that these people believed in supernatural entities. The importance of the Lion Man is also supported by the location in which it was discovered. Whereas most other ivory figurines were found amongst domestic debris, the Lion Man was discovered deep inside a Swabian cave, where little other evidence of human activity existed, suggesting that this ivory statue was used as part of a ritual. Another tantalizing insight into Aurignacian life at this Swabian cultural hub comes from the discovery of the oldest known musical instruments. 8 flutes have been found in 3 different caves, alongside Aurignacian tools. Most were made from the hollow bones of birds, but 2 were carefully carved from ivory. The ivory flutes were crafted by an intricate process of splitting, hollowing, and rejoining an ivory rod before carving finger holes. The most complete Aurignacian flute was 21 centimeters long, had 5 finger holes, and was made from the bone of a vulture. Moving now to the rock art of the Aurignacian, we find greater variety. Images were engraved or painted on the walls of rock shelters and caves. Some of this art has been found on blocks that fell off the wall and were buried over time alongside Aurignacian camp debris. In northern Spain and Italy, scattered evidence in 5 caves proves that rock paintings were made during this early phase of the Upper Paleolithic. Some of these were symbols such as discs, P-shaped signs, and outlines of human handprints. Others were animals, including bison, lion, horse, and bear. Some were made with red paint, produced by combining water with ochre powder. In Italy, an especially intriguing painting of a human figure with horns was discovered on a stone block that had fallen from the wall, raising the possibility of another human-animal hybrid. However, the greatest insights into Aurignacian rock art come from southern France. One important area is the Dordogne region, where several caves along river valleys mark another cultural hub of the Aurignacian. Much like Swabia, the Dordogne has yielded some of the largest concentrations of symbolic artifacts, including hundreds of ornaments and, at 13 different caves, rock art. It's theorized that both Swabia and the Dordogne were aggregation sites, places where multiple bands of people would meet for a short time once a year. These gatherings could have consisted of more than 100 people and would have been opportunities to catch up with old friends, form new relationships, and celebrate together. It's possible that special rituals and artistic production were part of these activities. In the caves of the Dordogne, it seems like rock art was part of everyday life. Alongside the refuse of cooking and toolmaking, people engraved symbols and images into the soft limestone walls. Some of these engravings were also painted black and red. Hundreds of images have been found, most of them on collapsed blocks. Much of this rock art is abstract, with simple geometric symbols, including rings and dots. One intriguing symbol is repeated across these caves and resembles stylized female genitalia, specifically a triangular or rounded pubic area and vulva. An alternative interpretation of this sign is that it represents the footprint of an animal. Alongside these abstract symbols, we find representational rock art, once again mostly of animals. Horses, lions, and ibex, a type of wild goat, are the most common subjects. The outline of these animals was engraved or painted from a side view. Dots and lines were engraved using stone or antler tools. Few details were included in the interior of the animal's body, which was instead filled with a series of aligned dots, reminiscent of decorative motifs found on Swabian ivory carvings. When painted, black was used for the outline and red for the interior of the animal. Isolated paw prints were also frequently engraved, including those of felines. The art was not the most technically sophisticated, but required substantial dedication to create and lasted for years. Aurignacian people repeatedly inscribed the same abstract symbols, mysterious to us, but meaningful to them. Much like in Swabia, the people of the Dordogne created images of certain important animals, but not reindeer, the animal that they most often hunted. Just as they selected the teeth of specific animals to hang on their bodies, they chose to depict animals to which they must have associated some larger significance. Outside of the Dordogne region, a few relatively simple Aurignacian paintings have been discovered at other French sites. But one cave in southeastern France breaks with this pattern. It's one of the most important artistic discoveries from the Upper Paleolithic. In the basin of the Rhone River lies Chauvet Cave. Only discovered in 1994, Chauvet contains the most remarkable collection of Aurignacian art. It's a large cave of several interconnected caverns, most containing paintings. 420 different images were painted here, some as much as 400 meters from the entrance of the cave. The artists mostly depicted animals, with over 70 lions and 70 mammoths. Horses, rhinoceros, bison, and bears are also among the most common. Abstract symbols were also painted, including dots, lines, outlines of hands, and palm prints, which were used to create enigmatic patterns. This art was made in 3 colors: black, red, and white. The black images were drawn using pieces of charcoal as crayons. This charcoal came from fires burned inside the cave. The red images were painted with a mixture of ochre powder and water, which was applied with the finger of the artists. Sometimes the red paint was also blown onto the wall to create circles and outlines of hands. The white images were made by removing a layer of brown clay that had accumulated on some of the walls to reveal the white limestone beneath. In areas where black charcoal drawings were made, the brown clay was completely removed by the artist, leaving a white background on which to work. In these cases, the white limestone was sometimes engraved with stone tools to highlight the black drawings. Sometimes the brown clay was mixed with black charcoal to create a palette of colors to work with. Interestingly, the red paintings tend to be simpler and focused near the front of the cave. The further back one progresses, the more complex the art becomes. Several caverns in the back of the cave were drawn primarily with charcoal. Some are large panels measuring up to 10 meters wide and allowing for complex compositions of several animals arranged to tell narratives. For example, the famous lion panel in the end chamber shows a scene of a pride of lions hunting a herd of bison. In some sections, the artists used the natural curve of the wall to create a three-dimensional sensation, in which lions on one side of the cavern seem to be watching the bison on the other side. Unlike other Aurignacian rock art, mastery of sophisticated artistic principles is on display at Chauvet. Shadowing within the bodies of the animals is achieved by the artists by blending the charcoal with their fingers after the initial drawing. Animals were drawn in a naturalistic manner, demonstrating the artist's familiarity with their subjects, which were often depicted in motion. Within panels, artistic perspective was achieved, with some animals portrayed behind others. I could go on trying to describe the beauty of these drawings, but nothing can substitute seeing them for yourself, and I highly recommend looking up some of the pictures from Chauvet. I will post some on the podcast's website. Also, the cover image for this podcast that you see when you click on Our Prehistory is the horse panel from Chauvet, often cited as the most evocative work from this cave. The talent displayed in these paintings is unparalleled during the Aurignacian. In fact, even after they were directly dated to 36,000 years ago by dozens of radiocarbon dates on charcoal from the drawings themselves, several academics rejected the idea that people from the early Upper Paleolithic had the capacity to create such technically competent images. But thorough research leaves no other explanation besides these cave walls being covered by ancient Aurignacian masterpieces. Chauvet is exceptional, although it shares some similarities with contemporaneous art, such as a focus on dangerous animals, stylistic methods of drawing animals, and a few symbols. Chauvet exceeds all other sites. We don't know whether there were more Chauvets during the Aurignacian that had been lost to time. Regardless, this cave must have been a special place to Aurignacian people in southern France. The ambition displayed on the charcoal panels is monumental in scale, created with great care and thought, and built on a base of artistic knowledge. Chauvet may have been used for ceremonial purposes. The most impressive images were drawn in the deepest parts of the cave, where no natural light reached and where no regular camp activity took place. It's been suggested that these charcoal drawings were composed to create the illusion of movement when seen in flickering firelight. Whoever decorated the walls of Chauvet wanted to create something that would last, something that people would return to and gaze at in wonder. The ornaments and art of the Aurignacian are fascinating. But what led to the intensification of symbolic production during the Aurignacian? I've read quite a bit about this period and have yet to find a compelling answer. Many experts hint at the idea that this production reflects a fundamental change in social organization, such as greater hierarchy, greater craft specialization, or the introduction of new religious practices. We've already discussed the idea that ornaments may have been part of new gift-giving customs. Another popular theory is that an increase in population size during the Aurignacian might have led to these social changes. Unfortunately, there's little concrete evidence to support any of these ideas. It's worth noting that the greatest period of Aurignacian ornamental and artistic production came after the extinction of the Neanderthals, around 40,000 years ago. We can only speculate as to how this demographic change affected cultural practices. Despite the mysterious nature of Aurignacian art, there are some interesting conclusions about the Aurignacian worldview that we can draw from the images contained within their artwork. Some of these inferences are informed by the study of modern-day hunter-gatherers. In order to explain the appearance of art in general, we have to ask a basic question. Why do people create art? Some historians will argue that humans have an innate desire to make beautiful things. In other words, art for art's sake. This explanation could also apply to the crafting of ornaments to decorate their body. But most experts believe that the purpose of art was more substantial and reflects values of the culture in which it was created. Art is often used by hunter-gatherers as part of rituals, and so is often thought to relate to spiritual ideas. With that in mind, one clear trend in Aurignacian art is the central role of specific animals: lions, mammoths, horses, bison, and rhinoceros. When Aurignacian people created images, they rarely chose to represent humans, instead painting and carving large, powerful, and dangerous animals. What does this tell us about how they saw the world? It may be that they were inspired by these creatures, which were a formidable presence in the Ice Age steppe. The familiarity of Aurignacians with these animals is revealed in their art. For example, both carvings and paintings portray the ears of lions in different positions, depending on whether they wanted to depict them as alert, relaxed, or attacking. Lions are ubiquitous in Aurignacian art, and it's been suggested that humans may have felt a special connection to them as fellow hunters. Cave lions are an extinct species that hunted large herbivores on the cold grasslands of Eurasia. At 2 meters long, they were larger than African lions. The appearance of this animal in Aurignacian art has been interpreted as a metaphor for human beings. This connection between lions and people is supported by the Lion Man sculptures of Swabia. But the consistent portrayal of animals in Aurignacian art might go beyond mere admiration to a spiritual connection. By learning from hunter-gatherer cultures that still exist today, we know that animism is a spiritual belief held by people within nearly all of these societies. Animism is the belief that non-human, natural objects like plants, animals, rivers, rocks, and thunderstorms have minds, souls, interact with people, and make decisions that impact human life. Apparently, this is a universal belief that arises in societies where human life is intimately interwoven with nature. It seems likely that prehistoric hunter-gatherers, including Aurignacians, had similar beliefs. From an animistic perspective, specific animals are said to possess certain human personality traits. Lions might be fierce, bison grumpy, and deer graceful. It would be consistent with what we know about hunter-gatherers if Aurignacian figurines and paintings were made with the purpose of establishing a spiritual connection with a specific animal. People may have been seeking the strength or favor of those creatures, which they believe to have power over their fortune. A similar thought process may lie behind the selection of specific animal teeth for ornaments, where fox, wolf, and deer were favored. Our analysis of Aurignacian art might be informed by other spiritual beliefs that are common but not universal in hunter-gatherer societies. First, a cosmology is an explanation of the origin of the world, and often involves mythological stories with supernatural beings. It's possible that Aurignacian paintings were illustrations of those myths, in which large, powerful animals played key roles. The Lion Man may have been a mythological character in one of those stories. On the other hand, shamanism is the belief that certain people have the ability to communicate with the spiritual world and have special powers. These shamans often commune with the spirits by entering altered states of consciousness, induced by taking hallucinogens, rhythmic dancing, and fasting. In a study of 33 modern-day hunter-gatherer cultures across 4 continents, more than 70% believed in shamanism. Typically, only 1 in about every 50 people are shamans. A popular theory generated by influential academics is that the origin of Aurignacian art comes from an attempt by shamans to depict the visions they had when under the influence of psychotropic substances. This connection between art and shamanistic hallucinations has been documented among the Khoisan people of southern Africa. One argument for this theory is the presence of art deep in caves, which may have been seen as a link to the underworld. Also, the Lion Man has been argued to be a depiction of a shaman. Although Aurignacian shamanism might be plausible, it's hard to draw a definitive link between this belief and the origin of art. Whatever the specific connections between religion, ritual, and art, there's one relatively solid conclusion that we can draw. This is the first period of prehistory when the mental world of people emerges to us from the darkness. And what we find is that the Aurignacian people shared a broadly similar worldview. The consistent depiction of lions, mammoths, horse, bison, and rhinoceros reveals a shared underlying belief system. Their choice of subjects was not random, but determined by specific stories and beliefs involving powerful animals. Art was not simply an opportunity to create beautiful images, but an expression of a shared culture. Exactly what these animals represented, and how depictions of them were incorporated into their life, we will probably never know. In our next episode, we will move further along the Upper Paleolithic timeline to the Gravettian period and discover how European life continued to evolve. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.